coal, railroads, electric, all those big conglomerates. And they didn't like Scott, so they kicked him out. He's at Chautauqua. He says, I believe in the principles on which this country was founded if I read history correctly. Liberty, justice, and right. Protection, prosperity, and preparedness is the morality of the pigsty, where you are fattening up porkers for winter hams. He had a way with words, in my view. So I think what's really interesting around Scott's work at this time is exactly, I think it's fun here standing with this table between us because it goes back to Scott's old debating days. In the teens and 20s, he could give up to 400 speeches and he might debate 25 to 50 times a year. And he would debate people like Clarence Darrow and Bertrand Russell and other people of that ilk at that time. I thought when the next debate you watch on television or listen to on the radio or put yourself through, especially when the presidential debates come around, I thought you should keep this in mind. The 3 rules that Scott had that he got from his old teacher at UPenn, Simon Patton. These are the 3 rules to remember when you're watching a debate. Number 1, use your opponent's facts to disprove his argument. Number 2, if this is impossible, disprove or deny the validity of his facts. Number 3, if both of these things fail, shift the ground of the argument and approach the issue from another point of view he's not expecting. I.e., debate isn't about substance, it's about winning. And Scott would view it as another form of competition. And curiously enough, one of the dichotomies of Scott was he was very good in some of those competitions, though he was believing in a more cooperative world. In the long run, I think what Scott really wanted to do was he saw the collapsing and crumbling of capitalist society around him. You have to remember, he's born in 1883, as Eliot said. He comes out of a Dixonian world of industrialism. There are 12-year-old boys sitting on the breakers in his grandfather's coal business, picking out slate for 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Scott saw this, and he was very conscious of this. And what he wanted to do was bring forward a brotherhood, as he put it, through which collective action would take the money and the control away from the parasitic interests. And the parasitic interests were people who lived on unearned income. Dividends, Wall Street, those folks. He said the people who make should be the people who have. And the people who don't make shouldn't get what the people who don't have are making. In the long run, the way he viewed it, and there's some controversy around Scott's defense of the Soviet Union and Albania and other like-minded places. I think the way you can look at it is Scott viewed it as capitalism was crumbling. Because it had gone on so long, the only next step, natural step for capitalism to make to protect itself was fascism. So to get out of that problem, you needed to go through the collectivist stage. And because we've gone so far towards the fascism stage, the collectivist phase was going to be a trial by fire. And that's what the Soviet Union hopes to have. But the point was, he had a millennial sense of what was coming next. And the idea of the withering away of the state. And what would the state, when it withered away, leave? A confederated grouping of individuals based on a cooperative society of mutual aid. Now, a lot of people have said, well, we've read Scott's books, and he doesn't give a detail. Okay, you go here, you go here, you go here, you go here, you build this, and you go there. And I've come to think that actually is one of the brilliances of Scott's idea. Because what he's done is, he says, this is the arc of where you want to go. Here's the grand scheme. Brotherhood, cooperation, mutual aid, non-exploiting, social justice. But he didn't give you all the detailed steps, which means you can't go out and fight over dogma. You have to go out there. He also believed in personal responsibility. This came from his studies with Helen in the occult sciences, going back to the Theosophy Society. And they really believed and practiced that you had to visualize and take responsibility in your individual life. And the video we have at the Good Life Center of the Nearings from 1976, Scott's out there saying, if nothing else, if all I've done, the best that I leave behind is that 1 inch of soil in the garden that wasn't there before. If that's my only legacy, then that is a good legacy. I can die satisfied. I think certainly he would have liked otherwise. But if you go back and look, Scott's ideas are very simple. And this is how the political gets tied to the back to the land. If you don't have healthy soil, you don't have healthy plants, you don't have healthy animals, i.e. humans, therefore you cannot have a healthy social organism. And it cycles around again. If you don't have a healthy social organism, you're not going to have healthy soil. And the cycle begins again. But you have a chance to build something new if you have that soil building built. And that's why the composting was one of the most radical things he could do physically in his life and pass on to people to pay attention to that fact. The Nearing's life back to the land is not a life of isolation and self-absorption. The Nearings, I just found a quote yesterday from Helen. She said, we went to the country not to make money, but to make time. They also went to the country to gain intellectual freedom. Scott had been taken out of his career. He was an academic. He was kicked out of 2 schools. That was over. He had to build a new life. But he still wanted to speak to the things I've been reading you without somebody saying, you can't say that or else you're going to lose your job. So the good life, the back to the land was the stable base on which he could stand. He had his healthy soil, so he could stand into the world and speak his truth. And hopefully bring something healthful into the world to take that next step towards a mutual aid society between individuals, between groups, between multinationals, and dealing with the natural world and the universe. Scott was very cosmological. There's no bifurcation here. It's all a piece, it's all a pattern. All right, let's see what I got left here. I'm trying to sum up 85 years of writing. Let's see, we did the Department of Justice. All right, here we go. Let's do this one. Enthusiastic dedication involves a reaffirmation. Each dawn offers a chance to pioneer. Those who would have a hand in this pioneering must expect to blaze trails and break new ground. We must dream of the promised land and dedicate our lives to bringing it nearer. Though like Moses, we may not live to see it. The good life is a pilgrimage. Thank you. Does anybody want to sit here and throw questions at us? I love questions. I don't know if Elliot would. Sure. Anybody got questions? You got a lot of people here. There's got to be questions. Yep.
I'm thinking about making a root zone. Does it have to be underground?
I've built 10 of them. It's one of the more fascinating low-energy options out there because nothing makes root crops happier all winter long than being dark, moist, and cool, and that's all free in a hole under the ground. The reason it should be under the ground somehow is because the key is to keep the root crops from freezing. And if you dig a hole in the ground and cover it over, it is cool, moist, and dark in there for free. I don't think I've ever seen one in our climate succeed above ground, but in England, they build them above ground, call them clamps, and just throw dirt and straw over your stored potatoes or something. But they're not facing the deep cold we face. Anybody in New England, I think, is going to want the hole underneath the ground.
Yep. Real quick, so, you know, I live in an intentional community. I'm part of the quote-unquote counterculture. I've read about the Nearings, and you're, Mr. Coleman, I couldn't have started the CSA without you, so thank you very much for all of your books and your work. The thing that really gets me all the time is all these folks that still eat food out of season and don't have the confidence to grow their. I know the Nearings had greens through the winter. You know, they had like an indoor, like a greenhouse, like right on their like their porch, basically. And do you have any thoughts or any quotes by the Nearings or thoughts yourself about ways of activating people to just grow a little bit more of their own food? I mean, people even in this room who may think they don't have enough time. Any sort of words of advice to sort of interrupt that apathy around, you know, making our food more decentralized and have more security around that?
Yeah, you sort of trap me from both sides. Since I sell food year-round, I'm glad there are at least a few people who don't grow their own. That's how I earn my living. But we go out of our way to encourage people to put in a garden, just even a pot on the back steps with a few herbs in it will make you realize that you can become part of that. To do it year-round, it's so simple to create a little sheltered space, either with a cold frame or a simple tunnel. And then you think, oh, yeah, what can I put in there? Well, then that makes you realize that there are crops that don't mind cold weather, like spinach and scallions, and there are crops that love warm weather, like tomatoes and cucumbers. And you put some of them in there in the summer, and they'll enjoy the extra heat, and you put the cold weather ones in there in the winter, and they'll enjoy the protection. This is just becoming aware of the incredible bounty of nature's resources, and how with a little study and thinking we can plug into it all year round.
I'd like to speak to that also. Something to consider is that when Scott and Helen moved to Vermont, Scott was 50. Now he had gardened in other places, but in 1954 they self-published Living the Good Life. It's really not until Shotkin picks it up in 1970 that it takes off, that it has a wider public, that they start drawing, you know, thousands of people to their house. So you have an era of 16 years right there between the publication and its effect. And I think Scott might say, you do the work, you're the model, you're patient, and you keep going. You can, persistence is your best motive. That you can't force people to education. There was people down in southern Vermont, where I'm from, Jamaica, where they had their first homestead, and there were natives. And I've talked to several of them who've passed on now, and they did not like this. They thought the vegetarianism was kind of crazy. They really didn't like the communism. But they said, you know, the Nearings worked. And they respected that. They saw that. And it's just over time. Persistence is your best advertisement for all your, what you're trying to get across.
Another story they used to tell of when they decided that it was too much work to take down the metal chimney for their sugar evaporator and then put it back up every year, and they used it as a form to make a concrete chimney. And this was the neighbors in Vermont were watching, and one of them was overheard saying to the other, well, they may be communists, but they're damn smart.
I like your point, putting the practice and thinking of the Nearings in terms of going back to the land in the larger revolutionary movement context. I think that's the point, unfortunately, that not everybody gets, who's going back to the land or doing organic gardening or whatever. I wonder if you could say more about that and what kind of strategy did Scott and Helen have for making the revolution?
It was daily. It was persistent. Every day was planned. There was a calendar of what they needed to do in the events. Every month was planned out ahead. Every year was planned out. They had 5 and 10 year plans, and they stuck to it. That was for the gardens. That was for the maple syrup business. That was for all of Scott's writing. That was for Helen's interest in the occult sciences and studies, her interest in handwriting, palmistry, astrology. They attacked everything diligently and persistently. I think that's part of the revolution, is when you're discouraged, you continue. The other thing to consider about the homesteading side of things, they said 2 things. Number one, that the homesteading was, when they came to Vermont, was a cyclone cellar through the Depression. And that's why they were able to leave it and move to Maine, because they needed to move to the next place. And the second thing is, they always called their work an experiment. It was always in process. And sometimes your experiment provides you with the answers you don't want. Sometimes an experiment is a failure. What's important is you learn the lesson and you don't repeat it and you find what might work. So at times, the prescriptions that they have seem almost so bedrock simple, and yet we're still having such a hard time learning them, embodying them.
When the first shotgun edition of Living the Good Life came out, there was an introduction by Paul Goodman. And it's wonderful, because he says in there that he thinks if we're going to continue to have a democracy, we need at least 25% of the population who can feed themselves, because you need that amount, that percentage of the population who can tell an oppressive government to go stuff it in order to keep from being oppressed. And in all the time I've been working on organic farming, I've come to realize this is one of the most radical things you can do. And if you understand the way both the Soviet communist system and the capitalist system have treated small farmers, they both have tried to get rid of them. And that's because nothing is more dangerous to a society that wants to control its people than people who can't be controlled, because not only can they feed themselves, but they can create their own fertility for the food they're growing. In fact, if you want to look at it, the compost heap is probably the foundation of revolution.
And I'll just add to that radical comes from the Latin radix, which means root. Radical is the root. So there is no bifurcation between the gardening and the compost and a radical stance. Over here.
I'm really interested in how you spoke a little bit about like what Helen was interested in, called sciences, palmistry, blah blah blah. Do you have any like anecdotes about her life or their relationship? How like his philosophy like went together with her interests?
Helen told me once that when Scott was writing for that little magazine that came out of New York, what was that?
Monthly
The
review.
Monthly Review, that the editors were absolutely panicked when he sent in his article every week, that there would be something in there about the occult or about visitors from another planet, which they were both very, they loved flying saucers. In fact, I think there was a whole shelf of books in their library.
2 shelves.
That's the only time. I mean, you know, the fact that Helen had been Krishnamurti's girlfriend, I mean, my gosh, there's a whole book there. And she told a wonderful story that they were in India later, you know, back in the last time they traveled there, I guess, and whatever town they were in, she heard that Krishnamurti was having people could come and talk to him just to sign up. So she signed up and went in. And she said he was sitting there, and she said, Krishna, it's me, Helen. And he said, yes, my child. And she said, no, Krishna, it's me, Helen, remember? Yes, my child, what can I do for you? So he wasn't having anything to do with remembering the past once he became truly holy.
That's one of the areas that's really needs much more research and understanding, is just how important their studies in the occult sciences was. Helen told a story that when she first met Scott, it was actually the first time they really met was in November of 1928, and it was the day that Scott lost the governorship of New Jersey. He ran as under the Communist Party. And one of his first questions to her was, do you believe in fairies? And she said, of course. The basis of any modern romance, you can well imagine. But from that point, there was a very strong bond. And Scott's interest in the occult went back to his time in Toledo in 1916-17 and table tipping and seances. And he was very interested in that. And what I find interesting there is that in 1917, of course, when you have a seance, who shows up? Tolstoy, Lincoln. So Lincoln shows up, and Scott's question to Lincoln is, what do you think of the situation in the Soviet Union? And Lincoln's like, well, you know, you really need to figure that out for yourself down there. In 1950, in the late 40s, 47, you have the Roswell incident. And Scott and Helen go out and visit it in 1949. And there's an interesting crossing over between some theosophical mediums and the UFOs. So the mediums start channeling the aliens. So Scott and Helen go to one of these mediums and sits there and they go through it, and we have the transcript. And people are asking questions about the next world and how we can make things better. And Scott says to the medium, ask the alien, what does he think of the situation in the Soviet Union? The reply is, that's really your problem down there. But Scott was very, very interested in that whole area, and it was a close tie between them. I'll tell you one more story. When Helen went over in 1930 back to Scott says, you can live this austere life with me, or you can go back to the European experience you've had. Because she had gone over to study violin in Europe. And she goes over there, and at a certain point he gets enough money to write his book, War. And he writes to her, says, oh, I need somebody as a secretary. And I need these things, and I have the money. Do you know anybody who's interested? And by the way, I love you as much as 70 bushels of baked potatoes. That was Scott as his most effusive. And it won her. She came back from Europe. And they began their sojourn together.
And I agree with Greg. I think it's a wonderful story and a story that should be told. And I have often fantasized, especially after seeing Scott in Reds as one of the old-timers who performed there, that Warren Beatty as Scott and Annette Bening as Helen would be just a fantastic movie. And I'm sure Greg could write the screenplay. So if any of you have any connections, I would suggest that to them, because I really think that would be, they covered so much of the period that has led up to where we are now and the different movements that went on during it. They were connected to every part of it. So anyone who can pull strings in Hollywood suggest that. I'd love to see it happen.
I'll tell you one more story around the occult. Helen is going over to Europe. It's in the early 20s on the ship, and she meets a young man and starts talking with him. He's down in 3rd class, and she starts talking about it. He's going over to study religions. He's very interested in religions, and she starts talking to him about the theosophy, and he hadn't heard of them, and Buddhism. And so she goes back to her cabin and gets Arnold's Light on Asia and gives it to him. Well, you find out 3-4 decades later it was Joseph Campbell. These constant crossings are absolutely amazing in their life. And it happens with Helen, and she was with Krishnamurti. these crossings are amazing, and Scott was the same way, the people he ran with and talked with. They're absolutely fascinating lives, and they cover the entire 20th century.
Amplify, if you would, the move to Vermont from New York, I think, or
From Ridgewood, New Jersey.
Ridgewood, New Jersey.
Yep.
Why Vermont? And then I didn't quite understand why they left, or why Maine. And then the other thought is, was there any connection between the Nearings and Henry Wallace, who also believed in theosophy and was a highly brilliant man, or up in Sinclair?
They knew both of them. In fact, when Scott was in Arden, Delaware, from 1908 until 1915, Sinclair was his guy next door. And Sinclair was so untrustworthy with his tools that Scott wouldn't allow him to borrow them. And he also knew Wallace, he knew Norman Thomas. The list can go on forever. As to why they came to Vermont, the only real connection I can make there was that they looked in the Poconos and the Catskills. Prices were too high. Scott wanted to be farther out. And also, I believe, and this is just something, a theory I have, Scott's teacher from the University of Pennsylvania was Simon Patton. And Simon Patton had land in Walpole, New Hampshire. And they might have, because of that connection, been able to use that as a base to look in Vermont. I don't know any other reason why. They didn't come for maple syrup. They didn't know about it until after they got here. So I'm not sure that why they left. You got to remember, Scott comes to Vermont in 1932 at age 50, and they leave in 1951, 52. He's turning age 70. They've got 4,000 buckets up in the sugar bush. They've got two 6x18 pans they can run simultaneously when it's running hard. It's after the Second World War, and they can't get dependable help because nobody wants to work that hard anymore. On top of that, for the past 20 years, you've been cutting 40 cords of wood a year to feed everything. And now, when the people who buy the Nearing's sugar bush, within 2 years, put in an oil burner because there wasn't enough firewood available on the property. It was too far up on the hill that they couldn't go up and get it. And on top of that, Scott's 70. I think there was a point at which it was becoming problematic. And he was also prophetic. Stratton Mountain would not come in until 1961. They lived in 1951. But they saw it coming. And 1950 is the year the tar is completed between Manchester and Brattleboro. So now the 8-hour trip up from New York City is taking 4.5. And the traffic and the entire area changes and electricity comes in. I think there was just a lot of change, and I think that helped them propel Scott to go to Maine.
Scott also told a story about their sugar bush, because since it was up on a hill, rather than bring all the buckets down and take them back up every year, they actually built these concrete bunkers up there that they could store the buckets in. And this was during the Second World War. And they found that the FBI had been inquiring around the town to see whether these were gun emplacements that the nasty commies were building up on the hillside to help the enemy. That was a great story.
I remember Helen telling me that when they were in Vermont, one weekend or for a couple of days, she had to go somewhere else. They had been getting increasingly greater number of visitors who came to see what they were doing, and the few days that she was gone, Scott had to deal with the visitors, and when she came back, he said, "We're moving."
Anybody else? Yeah?
Could they have talked about any vision, any ecological catastrophe or experience?
Did they speak about it? Yeah, I think that's what Scott was particularly interested in, the area of soil because of the erosion. You got to think too, right through this 1930s, you have the Dust Bowl, and he's going on a tour around the United States, and he's in Washington D.C. when the dust storms come through, where you can't see anything. You can't see down Avenue okay. You can't see the Capitol. The dust storms are so bad. That's how bad the Dust Bowl was. That's not, it was horrific. And Scott was and he had come up to Vermont and seen what had happened in, as he says, the 250 years of the white man on the land, not taking care of the soil, washing out, erosion, depletion. And you have to remember, he also felt, and I feel too, is that any type of farming is a form of mineral mining. And if you don't replace that, if you don't step into the cycle and replace that, then you're going to impoverish yourself, and the entire environment starts at that point. I don't know if he probably talked a great deal to you about environmental things.
Well, the thing most visitors noticed more than anything else was Scott's compost heaps. And whenever he was working in the woods and came across saplings that were between 2 and 3 inches in diameter and at least 6 feet long, they would be cut specially and stored, and then they were laid up like this to make a 6 by 6 foot bin. And he'd just have it yay high to start with, and as he added ingredients, he would add these poles, and this was the compost heap. And even though they were just sitting there, it was amazing how well these heaps worked, because the weight of the ones on top would keep the ones below. And behind the garden, there were a range all the time of at least 8 or 10 of these, and new ones being made all the time. And he would go down on the beach and bring back seaweed after storms and layer that with the hay that had been cut on the field. But no, making compost was, you couldn't go by the garden and not be aware that there was this fertility factory right next to it.
Will he turn his heat?
Yeah, after they'd broken down to a certain degree, you'd set one up next door and turn that into it.
Yeah.
And we made compost like that for years.
Yeah, Elliot, I'm glad you were talking about the mundane things, even though they're the most important, but you may have written about this. Is there any way of doing greenhouses? We've had such odd weather this summer, and a lot of us are thinking about that, without using plastic or expensive glass. Have you found any other?
When they excavated Pompeii, they found an early a greenhouse, and it was sheets of mica. And that's probably as natural as you can get. We investigated plastic at the very start of getting interested in this game. And we were curious about the energy use. And so we found out what the embodied energy is in a square foot of plastic. And we assigned that to cover 1 head of lettuce. And then we found out how much energy it takes to ship a head of lettuce from California. And the fact that the plastic will last for 4 years, and you can get a head of lettuce in the spring and in the fall with that protection. And it turned out that doing it with a simple hoop house covered with plastic, we were only using 5% of the energy it would take to ship it in from a warmer climate. And so that felt pretty good. And then I asked friends who understand polymer chemistry whether plastic could be made from some natural feedstock, like soybean oil or something like that. And they said it could. It's just that right now the price is such that petroleum is the least expensive feedstock. So I saw The Graduate too, and I still laugh over that. I only have one word to say to you, boy. I usually though tell that story from another point of view of why we work so hard on trying to come up with better tools and techniques for small-scale farmers, because it's a hard way to make a living. And I tell people that I want to go up to some young graduate at his graduation party and put my arm around his shoulder and say, Ben, boy, I only have one word to say to you, farming. He can actually make a living at it. So we're working on trying to make the economics better. But yeah, the plastic, I've learned to tolerate it. It's awfully useful.
Wait, I have a question. Greg, in the 60s and 70s, when there was so much turmoil against the Vietnam War and the big demonstrations for against the war and for peace, and Brendan Puppet was very active in those. Scott and Helen did not participate in an active way in them, and I wondered if it was their anti-smoking, drinking feeling against culture, or did they feel too old to be out in the streets demonstrating, or what do you think?
I think here's another reason why I think the Nearings went to Vermont. At that point, Scott was heading towards 50, and through their interest in the occult studies or mysticism, that Scott felt he was passing out of a certain phase of his active life. This type of being a physical presence out there, doing the debates, and all that type of activism, that he felt in the second half of his life, he should start addressing the actual way in which they live. And he felt that naturally it should fall to the young, and that he would enter an age of, I don't know, it might sound pretentious, but almost of a prophet, a working prophet, because there was a very clear line of the stages of life of man that he had. And I think so that's why he decided, he was very much for it, but not to be part of it. He would support it. I mean, Scott's writing about the situation in Vietnam going back to '59. You know, you go back to his monthly review articles. He's acutely aware of Vietnam and all of Southeast Asia throughout the late '50s and early '60s. So it's not he just felt he was in a different stage of life. And when Scott made the decision, that was it. And you were going to pull him out of it. And so that's how I read Scott's response to that. And I think Helen followed in that vein. So, well, that was more, okay. Make a choice. One of you three.
Could you talk a little bit about the context in which they became back to the landers? Like, I feel like I remember from another talk of yours that it was a movement at the time, in the 40s as well?
In the 30s, there was a lot of back to the land in the 30s. You have somebody like Louis Brumfield. I think up this way there was Elliot Merrick also, and there was a whole spate of books in the early 30s about going back to the land. And really at that time, a lot of the people who were going back to the land had come off the land, off the farm. So it was a natural response to what was going on. I think what's happened now today is that we've gone through the fabulous 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and fewer people have had that experience of living on the land in order to go back to it and survive. And we have a joke at the Good Life Center that when the economy goes down, Nearing stock goes up. 2008 happened, we get a call from the Wall Street Journal. Because now there's a commodity behind that. Well, back in the 30s, there was a mini industry around that. Flagg's Method came out in the 20s. His book was big, and so you see this whole spate, and they were kind of building off that. It was only because Pearl Buck came up and saw what they were doing and said, you should write a book on that. It was the maple sugar book that they first wrote. But as Pearl Buck came up and said, this is really fascinating, you should write this up. And she was the impetus behind that. And that's why it didn't come out until 1954.
There were other people at the time who were in the 40s after the Second War. And one of them was Ed and Carolyn Robinson, and they had something called the Have More Plan. And by pure chance, Ed and Carolyn Robinson and Scott and Helen Nearing ended up living about 3 miles apart on this little peninsula, Cape Rozier in Maine. But the Nearings were very scurrilous about Ed and Carolyn Robinson, and their comment was, the Have More Plan. They should call it the Have Less, Be More Plan.
Wherever you go, competition.
Yeah.
Is there any experiences that can be gleaned from down there at Cape Rozier regarding cooperation and collectivization? I mean,
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked. There are 7 or 8 houses now, families, living on the Nearing's original 140 acres. They kept the little 4-acre piece down by the end by the ocean, but the rest of it all went to young people like I was back then. And we have the most wonderful unintentional community. I have the only tractor, and all the neighbors come over and get it to plow the snow off their driveway in the winter. My neighbor, Mark, who's a welder and metal artist, has a wonderful metalworking shop, and I go down there and weld stuff. My neighbor, Peter, has a great woodworking shop with a big planer. If I need to plane a whiteboard, I'll go up there and plane it. And we all figured this will all even out in the end, and if it doesn't, we'll be dead and we won't care. And it has just been the most delightful way to coexist with your neighbors. I'm responsible for keeping the tractor up, and Mark makes sure that there's a acetylene in the tank, and Peter makes sure the blades on his planer are.
Is there a plan for what happens next?
No, it'd be nice if all of our children moved in and followed us. That's never a guarantee. The nice thing about children is they go off and do their own thing, which is how I got to Maine. I didn't do what my parents do. I did. Whether this little community will exist as it is, I don't think it has to. I think it's just a wonderful model of the way people can live together, and models can then be reproduced anywhere.
And I think something you should remember too, something Wendell Berry says, is that there are bonds that are closer than blood. That you don't, the man that I bought my land from in Jamaica, Vermont, didn't know I was coming. His family didn't want the land. And he was gracious enough that our politics meshed, and we got along well, that he sold us the land. And it was because of the bond of understanding that we had. So there are bonds deeper than blood. It doesn't need to be bloodline. It's nice to be bloodline, but it's the closeness of heart and spirit that's the most important thing. And that's why the Nearings sold to people who came and they saw the spirit.
Now, they never forgave all of us for being meat eaters.
That's true.
All of us tried vegetarianism, and none of us stuck with it. And if you've ever seen anything from the Yurt Foundation, Bill Copperthwaite was a great friend of theirs, and I was telling him at a meeting over at the Good Life Center a couple of weeks ago that Bill was the Teflon meat eater. Helen liked him so much she would forgive him for anything, and Bill Copperthwaite was the only meat eater who wouldn't incur her wrath for his sins.
Yeah, I was wondering if either of them ever spoke of examples of mutual aid that they did find in Vermont, because my understanding, having grown up here and listening to my ancestors before me talk about life in rural Vermont, was that there were often forms of mutual aid, and you spoke of this arc, culminating in mutual aid, and how much they were able to access that as outsiders, and if that had something to do with their moving as well. So there's a couple questions in there.
Yes, there was a natural mutual aid in Vermont, because that's how they had survived up in the area without money. And the Nearings tried to tap into that as much as possible. You have to remember, going back to Scott's early interest when he was a student at the University of Pennsylvania, his professor said, there's one thing you can do that will destroy your career, and that is if you take on the idea of redistribution of wealth. And Scott went to it like a beat on. So when Scott goes up into the valley, one of the things that the valley doesn't have is cash. And in the middle of the Depression, Scott provides employment so that people can get cash so that they can pay their taxes. That's huge, absolutely huge. He saw where the need was and he provided it. It was cash, and we think that's not mutual aid. Well, it is, because the family next to him had 13 children. And they went in and did shares when they did maple syrup. So they split things out by share, not just by money. So that there was this type of equitability going on.
Yeah, I was about to say, though, sometimes they might not have noticed that there already were the type of things that they were interested in. Living the Good Life, they take 2 or 3 sentences to just totally cast off the family they bought the property in Maine from as sort of dilettantes, and the people they bought the Maine from, land it came from, actually wrote a book saying, hey, wait a minute. We were actually working hard on that. And you can't just throw us off with a couple of sentences. So maybe they might not have noticed things in Vermont the way they didn't notice things in Maine.
Yeah, when they had a beeline going, they went straight.
Anyway, Ilka, I think we all ought to say happy birthday
To Scott.
Happy
Thank you for your interest and your patience.
Thank you.
Do you want to go try to talk to Greg? Go for it. Just go really quick because everyone's going to want to talk to you. Oh, hold on. Go ahead.